The waiting room was crowded and full of noise. Young men and women sat in rows, holding their instruments, fixing their hair, and whispering to each other. The air smelled of perfume, fresh paper, and nervous sweat. Everyone wanted to look perfect. Everyone wanted to shine. When the plain woman walked in, the air seemed to shift. She was not dressed like the others. Her coat was old, the seams worn down from years of use. Her shoes looked tired. Her hair was simple, tied back without shine or glamour. In her hand, she carried only a folder with sheet music. No glitter, no fancy cover. The eyes in the room turned toward her. Some faces twisted into smirks, others into quiet laughter. A group of young girls in bright dresses nudged each other and whispered. One boy with a guitar leaned back and chuckled. As if her presence was already a joke, she heard them, of course she did. But she kept walking. Her steps were slow, steady, like someone used to carrying weight. She found a seat in the corner and placed the folder carefully on her lap. Her hands rested over it like it was something precious. The whispers grew. A tall contestant in sharp clothes leaned toward his friend and said in a low voice, "What is she doing here? This is not a place for people like her." The friend laughed softly. "Maybe she is lost." They thought she could not hear, but every word slipped into her ears. The receptionist at the desk called names one by one, her voice clear, professional. But when her eyes met the plain woman's, there was a small pause. The receptionist blinked as if surprised. She quickly looked down at the paper again. Her pen tapped the desk. She seemed to be thinking something but said nothing. Only her raised eyebrow betrayed her doubt. Contestants walked in and out of the audition room. Some came back smiling, some came back pale. The judges' voices could be heard sometimes through the door. Sharp words, quick laughs. A girl with golden hair played the violin and came out beaming, her friends hugging her. A young man sang a pop song, and though his voice cracked, he still earned claps from the hallway. Each success and each failure added more tension to the room, but the plain woman sat quietly. She did not fix her hair or look at herself in a mirror like others. She did not pace the floor or hum nervously. She simply sat, her eyes lowered to the folder on her lap. Her fingers tapped lightly on the cover, not with impatience but with rhythm, as if some song lived in her mind that she could hear alone. More whispers followed. "Does she even know what this audition is for?" one girl sneered. "She looks like someone's aunt who wandered in from the street," another replied. "She will embarrass herself, just wait." Their laughter was soft but cruel. The plain woman shifted slightly in her chair but said nothing. Her eyes stayed calm like a lake that hides storms below. The judges inside were growing tired. Hours of faces, voices, songs, and performances had dulled their excitement. One judge, an older man with sharp glasses, sighed loudly every time another contestant walked in. His notes were quick, careless. Another judge, a woman in bright clothes, leaned her chin on her hand, tapping her nails against the table with boredom. When they looked at the paperwork of the plain woman before her turn, they frowned. Her age was older than most of the others. Her background simple, no famous teacher, no big school. Just years of practice written in plain lines. "Another waste of time," the male judge muttered under his breath. Back in the waiting room, her name was called. The receptionist's voice echoed, clear but softer than before, as if even she doubted the name she spoke. The plain woman rose slowly. Her chair made a faint sound against the floor. Heads turned again, eyes followed her as she stood. Clutching her music folder to her chest, she walked past the rows of shining contestants, past the mocking eyes, and into the hallway that led to the stage. The sound of her shoes was faint, but each step seemed heavy with meaning. People whispered again. Laughter tried to follow her, but soon the heavy door closed behind her, and she was gone from the waiting room. Inside the hall, silence waited. The judges leaned back in their chairs, already sure of what would happen. The audience in the back shuffled, expecting nothing. They had already decided she was not worth their time. But the plain woman walked forward slowly, steadily, toward the piano waiting at the center. Her hands did not shake, her eyes did not wander. She sat down on the bench, placed her folder gently on the stand, and drew a deep breath. No one knew what was about to happen. No one guessed that the woman they mocked would soon turn the hall into stone silence. They only saw a plain figure on a wooden bench, but she was about to make the piano speak in a way none of them would ever forget. The door closed behind her, and the waiting room filled with low laughter again. Some contestants leaned closer to each other, whispering words that cut like knives. A young woman in a sparkling red dress smirked. "She looks like a cleaning lady who lost her way." Another replied, "Maybe she thinks this is a talent show for old folks." Their voices rose just enough for others to hear, and the giggles spread across the room. The boy with the guitar leaned back in his chair. Strumming a careless note, he shook his head slowly. "She's going to embarrass herself, you'll see. The judges won't last more than 10 seconds with her." His friend laughed, covering his mouth as if to hide the cruelty. 10 seconds, that's generous, I say 5. They laughed again, louder this time, filling the room with arrogance. In the far corner, one girl with dark eyes frowned at the others. She didn't join the laughter. Instead, she whispered to herself, "Why judge her before she even plays?" But her voice was too soft and no one noticed. The crowd was too busy making jokes at the expense of the plain woman. The receptionist behind the desk shuffled through the papers. Her fingers paused on the woman's file again. She tilted her head, confused by the age written in bold ink. Most contestants were young, their resumes full of schools, teachers, and polished performances. But this woman's paper was different. Just plain notes of years. No famous names, no glowing praises. The receptionist sighed quietly, tapping the paper with her pen before setting it aside. Inside the audition hall, the judges shared their doubts aloud before she even reached the piano. "Another one wasting our time," one judge muttered, rolling his eyes. The woman in the bright dress adjusted her scarf and replied, "Look at her profile, nothing special. Why do we have to sit through this?" The older man with glasses pushed his chair back slightly, resting one arm on the table. "We'll let her play for a minute, then end it quickly. No point stretching this out." Their words were heavy with dismissal, like a door shutting before it could even open. Back in the waiting area, the whispers turned into full conversations. "She's going to crack a note or hit the wrong key, I bet." One girl laughed. "If she even remembers her notes," another added. The boy with the guitar grinned and said, "I've seen people like her before. They think passion is enough, but without talent and training. Passion is just noise." The group around him nodded, feeding each other's arrogance. Minutes passed slowly, and every sound from the audition hall seemed to carry through the thick door. At times, faint notes of music reached the waiting contestants, but they quickly died away. Nobody in the waiting room seemed to pay attention. They were too busy sharpening their cruel words. Each joke made them feel bigger, while the memory of the plain woman made them laugh harder. But there was one small shift. The girl with dark eyes who had stayed silent leaned forward, listening closely to the muffled sounds beyond the door. She thought she heard something unusual, not just the clumsy noise the others predicted. Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. She knew if she did, the others would laugh at her too. Inside, the plain woman sat before the piano, steady and calm, but outside, her reputation was being torn apart piece by piece. The whispers became bets. 5 coins, say the judges. Stop her before she finishes the first page. No, no. Before she reaches the first line. Their laughter echoed like a cruel chorus, filling the space with mockery. A young man in a sharp jacket leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Why do people like her even bother? This is not a place for plain faces. It's a competition for stars." His voice carried a tone of pride, and the others nodded in agreement. For them, music was not about feeling, not about soul. It was about how bright you looked under the lights. The receptionist glanced up from her desk and studied their faces. She did not laugh, but she also did not stop them. Perhaps she too believed the plain woman would fail. Perhaps she thought it was not worth her breath to defend someone who looked so ordinary. In the back corner, the dark-eyed girl folded her arms tightly. Her chest felt heavy with something unspoken. She didn't know why, but her heart resisted the crowd. She thought about the plain woman's calm eyes, the way her hands rested on the music folder like it was treasure. She whispered again, almost inaudible, "Sometimes, plain things hide the brightest light." The door creaked faintly, and every head turned, expecting the plain woman to come out quickly, defeated and embarrassed. Some leaned forward eagerly, ready to enjoy the sight of her failure. They waited, seconds stretched, but the door did not open. No footsteps came, no one returned. A strange pause hung in the air. The boy with the guitar clicked his tongue. "See, she's probably frozen, she can't even start." Laughter followed, more cruel this time. Filling every corner, the arrogance in the room grew thick. But underneath it all, a thin thread of unease began to twist, though no one admitted it yet, because while they laughed and mocked, Something was happening inside the hall, something none of them had expected. The plain woman's fingers had touched the piano, and the air on the other side of the door was no longer filled with failure, but with something powerful, something alive, and soon, their laughter would choke in their throats when they realized what they had missed. The heavy door closed behind her, and the sound echoed through the audition hall. The plain woman stood there for a moment, still and calm, while the judges looked at her with bored expressions. The lights above shone too brightly, making her coat look even more worn. Her shoes more tired, she did not flinch. She did not lower her eyes. Instead, she slowly walked toward the piano waiting at the center of the stage. The judges exchanged quick glances. One of them leaned back in his chair and whispered, "This won't take long." The woman in bright clothes tapped her fingers on the table and sighed. "Another one wasting our time." The older man with glasses adjusted them and muttered, "Plain face, plain papers, plain life." Their words were sharp but low, spoken with the kind of certainty that comes from judging too many people too quickly. The audience in the back was small, but even they shifted uncomfortably. Some looked at her with doubt, others with pity. Nobody leaned forward with interest. Nobody expected anything worth remembering. The silence was not hopeful but heavy, as if everyone was waiting for a failure they had already decided would happen. The plain woman placed her folder gently on the piano stand. Her hands lingered there for a moment, then she took a slow breath. Not rushed, not nervous, but steady. Her fingers brushed the keys lightly, not playing yet, just touching as if greeting an old friend. Her back was straight, her face calm, her eyes fixed on the keys like they were the only truth in the room. One of the judges leaned closer to his notes and scribbled something before she even played. A short line, a careless mark, as if he had already decided what to write. The bright-clothed judge whispered, "She looks more like a teacher than a performer." Dull. They chuckled softly among themselves. Their doubt was not hidden, it was thick in the air. The plain woman heard it all. She could feel the weight of their eyes, the cold of their silence, the heat of their laughter, but she did not speak. She did not argue. She sat quietly, her fingers resting on the piano keys. Waiting for the moment inside her, memories stirred. Years of practice in dim rooms. Nights where only her and the piano spoke. Days where no one clapped, no one listened, but still she played. Those years were in her hands now, unseen but alive. The stage was large, the lights harsh, the silence deep. Her plain clothes made her look small against the grand piano. But when she lifted her hands slightly above the keys, something in the room shifted. The bright-clothed judge stopped tapping her nails. The man with glasses narrowed his eyes, and even the audience leaned ever so slightly forward. There was something in the way she sat, something in the way her fingers hovered. It was quiet, but it was not weak. It was the silence before a storm. In the waiting room outside, the contestants laughed and whispered still, but faint notes were beginning to slip under the door. They did not pay attention at first, too caught up in their pride. But the girl with dark eyes raised her head. She heard the difference, though it was faint. She leaned closer, her breath caught. Something was happening inside that room back in the hall. The plain woman pressed the first key. The sound was soft, almost fragile. Like a whisper in a dark room, one of the judges tilted his head, unimpressed, ready to interrupt. But before he could speak, her hands moved again. Faster this time, stronger. Each note layered on the last, building something larger. The soft whisper turned into a voice, the voice into a cry. The piano began to breathe under her touch. The judges froze, pens lifted from paper. Their doubt still clung to them. But their ears betrayed them, they were listening now. The bright-clothed judge leaned her chin forward. The tapping of her nails stopped. The man with glasses pushed them higher up his nose, his eyes narrowing, not with dismissal anymore, but with focus. They had expected clumsy, but what they heard was precise. They had expected noise, but what they heard was music with life. Her fingers flew across the keys, not in panic, but in power. Every movement was sure, controlled. Years of practice echoed in each chord. Her face remained calm, her eyes focused only on the keys. She did not play to please them. She played because this was her truth. This was her language, the judges, the audience. The whispers outside, and none of it mattered now. The only thing alive was the music, one by one. The layers of doubt in the room began to crack. The audience grew still, their eyes fixed on the plain woman who moments before looked invisible. The judges leaned closer, their notes forgotten. Each key she struck carried more weight, more memory, more heart. The judges had doubted. The audience had doubted. Even the waiting contestants had doubted. But as her music filled the hall, those doubts began to melt. They realized they had made a mistake. The plain woman was not there to waste their time. She was there to remind them what true music felt like. And though her body looked ordinary, though her clothes were plain, her fingers told a story no one could mock. Each note rose above their laughter, silenced their sneers, and reached places words could not. She was not just playing a piano. She was pulling every soul in the room into her song, and the judges who had doubted her the most sat frozen, unable to look away. Her fingers rested for a moment above the piano keys. The room was silent, heavy with doubt. The judges leaned back, their pens ready to write a quick dismissal. The audience in the back waited for the mistake they were sure would come. Then she pressed the first note. It was soft, trembling like the sound of a single drop of rain. For a second, the judges almost smiled, ready to end it quickly. But then came the second note, then the third, and suddenly the trembling rain turned into a steady flow. Her hands began to move faster, not with panic but with certainty. The melody rose gently, then fell, then rose again. It was not just sound, it was feeling. The piano spoke with her. It told of nights of silence, of lonely rooms where only music was a companion. It told of mornings where dreams were laughed at but never broken. The sound was alive, breathing, reaching into every corner of the hall. At first the audience shuffled in their seats, but as the notes grew stronger, their movements stopped one by one, heads lifted, eyes widened, mouths slowly closed. The whispers that had filled the hall before she played were gone, replaced by stillness. It was as if every note demanded silence, demanded respect. The judges who had sighed now leaned forward. Their eyes followed her fingers. The pens in their hands were still. The plain woman's face did not change. She was calm. Her eyes lowered, her lips pressed together. But her fingers told a different story. They struck the keys with power, then touched them gently. Like someone holding both pain and hope at the same time, the melody twisted and turned. Sharp one moment, soft the next. The sound was unpredictable, alive like the beating of a heart. One judge blinked slowly, his pen slipping from his hand without him noticing. The bright-clothed judge forgot to tap her nails. She leaned forward, her eyes wide. The older man with glasses had stopped looking bored. Now he was staring with a strange intensity. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. The audience felt it too. A woman in the back placed her hand on her chest, breathing slowly. A man who had been yawning earlier now sat straight. Eyes locked on the stage, they had all been ready to dismiss her. But now they could not move. The piano had caught them, held them, and refused to let go. Outside the waiting room, laughter had gone quiet. At first, contestants had ignored the muffled sounds through the door. But then the sound grew clearer, stronger. The boy with the guitar frowned, his smirk fading just a little. The girls who had giggled leaned toward the door. Trying to hear more, the dark-eyed girl sat straight. Her heart racing, she whispered softly, "I knew it, but no one heard her." Back inside, the music grew louder. Her fingers danced across the keys, every movement full of control and emotion. The melody rose higher and higher until it seemed like the whole piano would burst. Then it dropped suddenly into a soft, aching whisper. The sudden change made the audience gasp. The judges exchanged glances, but none spoke. They were caught in her rhythm, trapped in the world she was creating. Each note seemed to carry a memory, a secret, a piece of her soul. The plain woman, mocked and doubted, had vanished. In her place was someone powerful, someone untouchable. The piano was no longer an instrument, it was her voice, and it was a voice too strong to ignore. The bright-clothed judge finally whispered under her breath, "My God." The older man with glasses pressed his palm against his chin, his eyes glassy. Another judge leaned so far forward his chair creaked loudly, but he did not notice. No one noticed anything anymore except her music. The plain woman kept playing, her body still, only her hands moving. Her soul poured out through the keys, and the hall seemed to shrink. It no longer felt like a cold stage and bright lights, it felt like her world. Her story, her truth. Everyone was inside it now. They could not escape, they did not want to. The last notes of the piece's first section rang out, soft but deep, echoing in the air. Then, without pause, she lifted the melody again, brighter, sharper. Her hand struck the keys with force that made the piano roar. The sound rushed over the audience like a wave. Some people flinched, some gasped, but none could look away. The judges who had doubted her were now leaning so close, they almost rose from their chairs. Their pens were forgotten, their notes empty. Their eyes followed her hands as if afraid to miss a single movement. The hall that had been heavy with doubt was now alive with awe. The plain woman did not look at them. She did not seek their approval. She was not playing for the judges or the contestants outside. She was playing for the music itself, for the years that had led her here, for every moment of pain that had taught her strength. The piano was her answer to every cruel word, every mocking laugh, every doubtful stare, and as her fingers continued to fly, the judges realized the truth. They had not just misjudged her, they had underestimated the very soul of music itself, and now they sat frozen, unable to speak, unable to move. As her storm of sound swept them all away, the music filled every corner of the hall. And then something strange happened. The audience, who had shifted and whispered before, became completely still. The air grew heavy, almost sacred, as if no one dared to breathe too loudly. The laughter, the doubts, the hidden smirks, all of them melted away under the weight of the sound. The plain woman's fingers moved with speed and grace, but more than that, with a kind of truth that pierced through skin and bone one by one. The judges who had leaned back in boredom now leaned forward. Their pens, once ready to dismiss, were forgotten on the table. The older man with glasses squinted, trying to understand what he was hearing. He had judged thousands of auditions, heard countless performances, but this was different. The bright-clothed judge who had sighed earlier now pressed her lips together. Her eyes locked on the piano. She no longer saw the woman's worn clothes or plain face. She only heard the storm of emotions pouring from the keys. The melody rose higher, fast and fierce, like a cry that had been trapped for years. Then it softened suddenly, falling into a whisper. The shift made everyone hold their breath, afraid to disturb the fragile sound. It was as if the piano itself was speaking, confessing secrets no one had ever dared to share. Every note wrapped around the listeners' hearts, squeezing them with sadness, then releasing them with hope in the audience. A young man who had been scrolling on his phone earlier slowly lowered it. His eyes blinked rapidly, his mouth slightly open. A woman near him clutched her scarf tightly, her lips trembling as if she was about to cry. Even the ushers at the back, who had heard performance after performance all day, stood frozen, staring at the stage. Outside the waiting room, the contestants grew quiet too. At first they had laughed, certain she would fail, but now, faint notes slipped under the door. Louder, stronger, impossible to ignore. The boy with the guitar frowned. His smirk gone, he tilted his head, listening, and for the first time his fingers stopped strumming. The group of girls in bright dresses who had mocked her leaned closer to the door. Their smiles had faded, replaced by confusion. The dark-eyed girl sat straight, her heart racing. She whispered softly, "Do you hear that?" But no one answered. They were too busy listening. Inside, the judges were no longer just listening. They were trapped. Each note struck something inside them, things they thought they had buried. The older man with glasses remembered his own childhood piano lessons, the way he had once loved music before it became only a job. The bright-clothed judge thought of her late mother, who had sung her lullabies that sounded almost like this. Another judge felt his chest tighten as he remembered failures he had never spoken of. The music was more than sound, it was memory, pain, love, and truth. The plain woman's face stayed calm. Her body moved only when her hands demanded it. Her eyes stayed on the keys, as if the rest of the world no longer existed. She was lost in the song, yet at the same time, she was guiding everyone else into it. The hall, once cold and judgmental, now belonged to her completely. The melody climbed higher again, fierce and unstoppable. Her fingers blurred across the keys, but each note was clear, sharp, perfect. The judges leaned even closer, as if afraid the sound would slip away if they looked anywhere else. The audience sat stiff in their seats, no coughs, no whispers, no movements, just eyes wide and hearts trembling. Then came a pause. Her hands hovered in the air for a split second. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of breathless expectation, and then her fingers fell again, softly, gently, like feathers landing on water. The contrast made the silence in the hall even deeper. The plain woman was not just playing the piano. She was controlling the very air people breathed. A man in the audience wiped his eyes quickly, embarrassed by the tears he could not stop. A woman near the front pressed her hands together, whispering something under her breath. For them, this was not an audition anymore. It was a confession, a prayer, a gift. The judges, once full of doubt, now sat motionless, their eyes glistened, though none of them would admit it aloud. The bright-clothed judge bit her lip, struggling to keep her face steady. The older man with glasses pressed his palm against his chin, hiding the tremble of his mouth. Another judge tapped his chest softly, as if calming a heart that was beating too fast. Outside the door, the waiting contestants were no longer laughing. The boy with the guitar shook his head slowly, whispering, "This is impossible." The girls who had mocked her earlier now stood silent, guilt creeping into their faces. The dark-eyed girl smiled faintly, proud and relieved. She had known there was something more to the plain woman, and now the music proved it. Back inside, the plain woman reached the height of her piece. The sound roared like a river breaking free, unstoppable, washing over everyone in the room. The judges sat stunned. The audience sat breathless. For those few minutes, no one thought about her appearance. No one thought about her age. They only felt the music, and in that feeling, they were united, all frozen in awe. When the notes finally softened again, echoing into silence, no one dared to clap too soon. They were afraid to break the spell. It was as if the hall itself was holding its breath, waiting, trembling, captured completely by the plain woman they had mocked only moments ago. Her hands moved across the keys with a power that did not belong to a plain woman anymore. Each note carried something deeper, as if her life itself was flowing into the piano. The melody turned soft again, and for a moment it felt like the hall was floating. The sound was not just music, it was memory. The judges and the audience did not realize it at first, but soon they felt it. The music was painting pictures in their minds. The older man with glasses leaned back in his chair, and suddenly he was no longer in the audition hall. He was a small boy again, sitting in his parents' living room. His mother's hand rested on his shoulder as he tried to play his first piece. He remembered the pride in her eyes, the warmth in her smile. It had been years since he thought about that moment. But now the music pulled it out from the shadows. His throat tightened and he blinked fast. Hiding the wetness in his eyes, the bright-clothed judge pressed her lips together as the melody shifted. She was reminded of a song her mother used to hum while cooking. She had not thought of it in years, but now every note from the piano brought it back to her. She could almost smell the food, hear the sound of laughter at the dinner table. Her chest ached because her mother was gone now. The music made her feel that loss again, but it also gave her comfort, as if the memory was alive once more. In the audience, a young man thought of his father, who had left home when he was still a child. The music sounded like a story of someone leaving, and then someone waiting. He gripped the edge of his chair, breathing slowly. He had never told anyone how much it hurt, but the piano seemed to know. A woman near him wiped her tears openly, not caring who saw. The music told her of her own struggles, raising her children alone, working night after night. The piano sang of loneliness, but also of strength, and she felt her heart open to it. The plain woman's face stayed calm, but inside she was reliving her own journey. She remembered the days when no one believed in her, when she practiced in silence while others mocked her dreams. She remembered working jobs to pay for the small piano she kept in her tiny apartment. Nights when she fell asleep with her fingers still resting on the keys. She remembered loss too, the people she had loved who were no longer there. Her music carried all of it, her pain, her sacrifice, her hope, and it poured out in waves. The audience did not see her memories, but they felt them. That was the power of her music. It did not just tell her story, it connected to theirs. Each person in the room thought of their own life, their struggles, their moments of joy and sorrow. The piano was like a mirror reflecting the truth hidden inside them. The boy with the guitar outside the hall leaned forward, his smirk gone completely. His hands tightened around the neck of his instrument. For the first time he looked shaken. He whispered, "How can she do this?" The girls who had mocked her were quiet too. Their faces pale, they exchanged glances but said nothing. The dark-eyed girl listened with wide eyes, her lips trembling. She felt as if the music was speaking directly to her, whispering courage into her soul. Inside, the melody rose again, faster, more powerful. The sound was no longer just sad, it was defiant. It shouted without words, "I am here. I have lived, I have fought." The judges sat stunned, their hearts pounding with each note. One of them clenched his fist tightly on the table, as if holding himself together. Another closed his eyes for a moment, letting the music wash over him. The plain woman was no longer invisible. She was a giant, filling the room with her spirit. Her plain coat, her old shoes, her simple hair, none of it mattered now. The music burned brighter than any jewel, stronger than any stage costume. She was more than the people who mocked her. More than the doubts of the judges, she was her music. And her music was unstoppable. The hall had become a place of confession. Every person sat still, but inside their hearts were screaming. Crying, remembering, healing. The music told them they were not alone, that pain could become beauty, that struggle could become strength. It reminded them that even in the darkest silence, there was always a note waiting to be played. Her fingers slowed, moving gently again. The melody turned tender, soft like a mother's lullaby. The bright-clothed judge could not hold back her tears anymore. They rolled down her cheeks silently. She covered her mouth, ashamed, but no one noticed, because everyone else was just as lost. The older man with glasses took off his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. He stared at the woman at the piano and thought, how did I not see this before she played? He had been so ready to dismiss her, but now he felt small in his chair. Humbled in the audience, some people cried openly. Others smiled faintly through their tears. Some sat frozen, unable to explain what they were feeling. It was more than music, it was life itself, and through it all, the plain woman did not lift her head. She let the piano speak. She let it tell everything she could not say with words. Each note was a piece of her soul, and each soul in the hall took it in. The laughter that had filled the world outside her was gone, replaced by silence heavy with awe. When the melody finally dipped into a whisper again, the silence grew even deeper. Everyone sat waiting for what would come next, afraid to break the spell. The plain woman's music had turned the hall into a place where every heart was open, every soul was bare. Her fingers moved toward the end of the piece. The melody was slowing, softening, as if it were breathing its last words. Each note hung in the air a little longer than the one before. The audience leaned forward unconsciously, pulled by the invisible thread of her music. No one coughed, no one shuffled in their seat. Every sound in the hall belonged to her and her alone. Her eyes stayed on the keys, her face calm, but her hands told the truth. The music grew tender, fragile, as though she were holding something precious in her palms. She pressed one final sequence of notes, low and deep, and then lifted her fingers into the air. For a moment, the piano was silent, but the silence was not empty. It was full of echoes, full of emotion still floating in the air. The judges froze in their seats, none of them moved. Their pens lay useless on the table. The older man with glasses had stopped breathing for a second. His hand trembled against his chin. The bright-clothed judge wiped a tear quickly with the back of her hand, trying to hide it. Another judge stared at the piano as if afraid it might speak again. The audience sat in a spell, their eyes wide, their lips parted, their bodies frozen in awe. They had never expected this. Not from the plain woman they had mocked with their silence when she walked on stage. Some wanted to clap immediately, to shout their admiration, but something held them back. The moment felt sacred, and no one dared to break it too soon. Behind the closed door, the contestants in the waiting room held their breath as well. They had gone silent minutes ago. Now they leaned closer. Straining to hear through the walls, the boy with the guitar's smirk was long gone. His fingers gripped the strings of his instrument, but he did not play. He just sat in silence. His pride was gone, replaced with confusion and respect he would never admit. The group of girls in bright dresses stared at the door. Guilt washing over them, the dark-eyed girl whispered, "They will never forget this," and for once no one argued. On the stage, the plain woman let her hands fall into her lap. She bowed her head slightly, not seeking applause, not expecting praise for her. The music was enough, the story had been told. She had given everything, and she sat in stillness, waiting. The judges exchanged glances, none of them spoke. Their eyes were wet, their hearts shaken for years. They had judged thousands of faces, thousands of performances, and most were forgotten by the next day. But this one was different. This one carved itself into their memories like fire into wood. The older man with glasses finally whispered, "Unforgettable." His voice cracked. The bright-clothed judge pressed her hand against her heart, struggling to breathe evenly. She had not felt this moved in years. Another judge leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, as if trying to steady himself after being hit by a wave. The audience still held the silence, some with tears on their cheeks, some with shaking hands. They wanted to clap, but they also wanted the moment to last. The echo of her last chord was still alive in their hearts, and they were afraid that clapping would chase it away, so they stayed still, eyes locked on her as if waiting for permission to breathe again. Seconds passed, though they felt like minutes. The plain woman raised her head slowly, her eyes calm and humble, looked not at the judges but at the piano as if thanking it, and then she stood, quietly, simply, her body small, her clothes plain, but her presence had become larger than life. That was when the first clap came. A single sound from the back of the hall. It was hesitant, almost afraid. But then another followed, then another. Soon the silence shattered under the sound of hands clapping. Growing louder, rising higher, within seconds the hall erupted. The applause thundered like a storm. Rising to the roof, people stood from their seats. First a few, then many, then everyone. A standing ovation shook the hall. The same audience that had doubted her, pitied her, and looked away from her before now cheered with all their hearts. Tears fell freely, voices shouted her name. The applause was not just praise, it was surrender. They had been conquered by her music. The judges stood too, rising slowly. Not because they had to, but because they could not stay seated. They clapped, they smiled, they nodded with respect. The bright-clothed judge whispered to herself, "She is a master." The older man with glasses closed his eyes and shook his head in disbelief, muttering, "I will never forget this woman." The plain woman bowed slightly, a small humble gesture. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. She was not smiling at the applause. She was smiling because the music had spoken. Her story had reached them. She had proved that beauty was not in clothes or faces, but in the truth of the soul. The applause continued, rolling over her like waves, but she stood calm, silent, steady. She had entered the hall as someone mocked, doubted, unseen. Now she stood as someone unforgettable. Her last chord was still alive in their hearts, and for as long as they remembered this night, they would remember her, the plain woman who froze the hall with her piano. The applause shook the walls, but the plain woman stood still. Her small bow and faint smile made her look even more humble, as if she did not believe she deserved such thunder. Yet the sound grew louder, rolling over her like a wave that would not stop. People clapped until their hands hurt. Some even shouted her name. Others whistled, all of them on their feet. The judges looked at each other, their faces soft with awe. They had been so certain she would fail, so sure she was nothing. But now they felt ashamed of their thoughts. The older man with glasses pressed a hand to his chest. Still shaken, the bright-clothed judge wiped her eyes openly now. No longer trying to hide the tears, another judge leaned forward and said softly, "She has given us something rare." Their voices were drowned out by the applause, but the truth was clear in their eyes. The woman stood beside the piano, her hands resting gently on the wood. She did not wave or blow kisses like other performers. She did not bask in the spotlight. She stood quietly, as if she had already left the stage in her heart. Her music had spoken for her, and she needed no more words. Slowly, the applause began to fade, not because people wanted to stop, but because they were exhausted from clapping so long. The silence that returned was different from the silence before. It was no longer heavy with doubt or judgment. It was full of respect, full of awe. One of the judges leaned forward and said, "Thank you. You have reminded us why music exists." His voice trembled. Another judge nodded. "We will never forget this performance." The woman only bowed her head again. She did not answer. She did not need to. The audience began to leave the hall, still whispering to each other. Some wiped their eyes. Others shook their heads in disbelief. "She looked so plain," one said softly. "But when she played, it was like another world." Another replied, "I will never laugh at someone by their looks again." People carried her music with them as they walked out. Each step seemed lighter, each heart changed. Outside in the waiting room, the contestants sat in silence. The boy with the guitar no longer smiled. His eyes were heavy with shame. He remembered every cruel word he had spoken, and now they burned in his chest. The girls in bright dresses lowered their heads, guilt washing over them. They had mocked her face, her clothes, her age, but she had left them powerless with her gift. The dark-eyed girl was the first to speak. "She showed us all," she whispered, and no one argued. The plain woman finally walked back through the hallway. Her steps were soft, her eyes down. She carried the same old folder in her hands. Her coat was still worn, her shoes still tired, but now, no one saw them the same way. When she entered the waiting room, The contestants rose to their feet without even thinking. They clapped again, softer this time, but filled with respect. Some even bowed their heads as she passed. She did not look at them with anger. She did not remind them of their laughter. She simply walked with quiet dignity, as if she had already forgiven. She had not come to prove them wrong. She had come to play, and in playing, she had proven everything. The receptionist at the desk, who had raised her eyebrow at the plain woman's profile earlier, now stood frozen, her mouth slightly open. She whispered to herself, "I almost doubted her too." Then she smiled faintly, humbled by the truth. As the woman reached the doors of the hall, she paused for a moment. She turned her head slightly toward the stage she had just left behind. Her eyes softened, not with pride but with gratitude. Gratitude for the piano that had been her only friend for years. Gratitude for the chance to finally let her music be heard. She took a slow breath and stepped outside. The night air was cool, the street was quiet. She walked alone, but she did not feel alone. The applause still echoed in her ears, but more than that. The silence she left behind in the hall lived in her heart. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not for her face or clothes, but for who she truly was inside the hall. The judges still sat at the table, their notes blank, their hearts full. One finally whispered, "We witnessed history tonight." Another nodded slowly. Yes, not a star made of glamour, but a soul made of truth. They knew the plain woman had changed something in them. And in everyone who had listened, the story of her performance spread quickly. People told their friends, their families, there was a woman. She looked ordinary, but when she played, the whole hall froze. Some stories added more detail, some less, but all carried the same message: never judge by appearance, because true beauty is hidden where you least expect it. The plain woman returned home that night to her small room and her old piano. She placed her folder back on the stand. Her fingers brushed the keys once, gently, as if to say thank you. She did not celebrate, she did not boast. She simply sat for a while in silence. Smiling faintly, she knew she had given her best, and the world had finally heard it. And so the woman they had mocked, the woman they had doubted, became unforgettable. She had walked into the hall as someone invisible. She walked out as someone eternal. The narrator's voice would echo the truth. They mocked her face, her clothes, her silence, but when her piano spoke, the world had no choice but to listen.